And that California connection was a San Francisco connection. The gentleman on the left is named Philo Farnsworth. Kind of sounds like he ought to be a character in The Simpsons or something like that, but it was a real name. And he actually had a laboratory at 202 Green Street in San Francisco, and there's a little monument right there. And he basically, what he did was he invented the first operational all-electronic television system on September 7th, 1927, when he was 21 years old. An amazing kind of thing. Again, it didn't really do very much. It didn't have a tremendous impact right away. But when you put it together with the vacuum tube and the Audion and everything else, it basically put in place the technological developments which were going to be such an important part of the California technological experience. So that's by way of background, DeForest and Farnsworth. But the guy that really was responsible for Silicon Valley being what it is and the technological importance of California is this gentleman. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of him. His name is Frederick Terman. He taught electrical engineering at Stanford. And he was very concerned during the 30s that all of his best students had to go back east to get jobs, that there was really nothing in California for them. What was back east? Well, at that point, the major technological hub was Bell Labs, which was in New Jersey. And all of his brightest students would get jobs back there or in some of the cluster of companies that surrounded Bell Labs. And Terman was very concerned about that. So in the mid-30s, what he did was he convinced a couple of his bright students to stay in the area and to try to set up some kind of company that would do something technologically oriented, and they did. These students of his, and they worked out of this garage, which is on Addison Street in Palo Alto, and they basically fiddled around, and they finally figured out a way to do better testing of electronic equipment. And this is during the 30s, and electrification was becoming, even in rural areas, because of some of the programs of the New Deal, much more significant in our national life. And the electronic components, once you started the thing, you didn't want it to break down in the middle of an operation. So testing of these kinds of things became super important. And so they set up their company in this garage in Palo Alto. And this garage is actually the first of three famous Silicon Valley garages, because they were Hewlett and Packard. And there they are later on in front of that garage. And HP, Hewlett Packard, basically what they did was they tested. That's what they did. They tested electronic companies. During World War II, the military was manufacturing. We've seen, during when we were talking about Rosie the Riveter and all of the ships and planes that were coming out of California during the war. There was a tremendous number of electronic components and all of these things. So testing these components and testing these systems to make sure that they would work proved to be very, very profitable for Hewlett and Packard, and their company became the first major electronics company in the San Francisco Bay Area. But Terman wasn't entirely convinced about that, that was enough. What he wanted to do is he wanted to know, he really realized that one of the reasons that Bell Labs and other places were doing so well was that they had clusters of companies around them. And as a very successful engineering professor, he moved up the ranks, and finally he became dean of the engineering school at Stanford. And one of the things that he decided to do was convince Stanford, which had then as now a huge amount of land. Nowadays, when you drive up Highway 280, there's a good amount of time when you got Stanford land on both sides of you, and if you go down Foothill Boulevard, which turns into Junipero Serra, you've got Stanford land all over the place. Well, they had a lot of land, on the other side, not only on the back side, but on the front side and on the side. And what Terman convinced the Stanford administration to do was take some of that land and set it aside as a place that was going to be headquarters or plant structures for various companies, to turn it into a kind of electronics hub. So that's what Page Mill Road looked like in the early 1950s. If you drive up 280 and go to Stanford, as I did for a number of years, you get off at Page Mill Road. And I'll never forget the first time that I did that, back in 1969. And you cross Serra Boulevard, and then you're going down Page Mill Road a little bit more. And on the right-hand side, it's just these building after building of these companies. And that was Terman who decided to do that. So that's how it looked like in the early 50s. The first tenant was Varian Associates, and that's them. They're building on the left. And on the very same year, 1953, Eastman Kodak decided to come in. Nowadays we think, well, what's Kodak? But back in the 50s, Eastman Kodak was a tremendously important innovator in photography and in other kinds of electronic devices as well. So to get Kodak in there was a huge thing, and you can see that the groundbreaking for Kodak was a big deal. This, of course, becomes Stanford Industrial Park, and it becomes kind of the West Coast hub where companies can be close to each other, they can learn from each other, they can interact with each other, and Terman was hoping the sum would be greater, the whole would be greater than the sum of its parts. So that was one thing. Really, Terman was a tremendously, Terman kind of basically laid the infrastructure with Stanford Industrial Park, but he also, with HP, with convincing Hewlett and Packard to stay here, he was kind of the enabler of one of the major seed companies of Silicon Valley to really take root here. The second person besides Terman was William Shockley. Shockley did work at Bell Labs, and there he is back in the I don't know exactly when this picture was taken, but he worked at Bell Labs and became very accomplished scientist. And he was the man who, in fact, invented the transistor. There he is on the right at Bell Labs. And the transistor was the major miniaturization invention of the 40s and 50s, and basically made possible the miniaturization revolution that was going to be such an important part of Silicon Valley and of the technology that we know. Shockley later on in his life became very controversial for a whole bunch of other reasons. He published articles and a book in which he argued that intelligence was racially based and had a whole bunch of very, very controversial things. But during this time, Shockley was it. And what Shockley decided to do in the 50s, he decided to leave Bell Labs and go out on his own. And he made a decision that was super important for the development of what we're talking about in this class. He moved out to California, and he moved to Mountain View, basically San Antonio Road and Mountain View, which is now, at least it was a couple of years ago, an international produce market. But that's where he set up the Shockley Transistor Company in 1956. And as the marker there reads, the first silicon device and research manufacturing company in Silicon Valley. The research conducted here led to the development of the Silicon Valley. Interestingly enough, this was put up, when Shockley had become very, I think it was put up when Shockley had become very, very controversial as a result of his genetics kind of stuff. So he's not mentioned, but he was super, super important. And as a guy that was already very well known, he was able to attract into his company a tremendously talented group of people, including some of these people. Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore are probably the most famous of these names. But back in the 50s, these people were some of the best electrical engineers in the world. And the fact that Shockley was able to get them to work for him in Mountain View was tremendously important. But Shockley, like a lot of people who think very highly of themselves, Shockley didn't think nearly so highly of anybody else, and so he was a very, very difficult person to work for. And he would kind of berate people, and he wouldn't support them, and people who felt that they were, as these guys were, on the cutting edge, felt that they should be given some leeway and the opportunity to kind of experiment. And if they make a mistake, fine, you learn from it, and you move on. But Shockley was not, if you made a mistake in the Shockley Transistor Company, that was not the way to get ahead. And so what happens is, within a couple of years, these 8 employees, whom Shockley called, as I have on the slide there, the traitorous 8, decided we have had enough of Shockley. And they wanted to form their own company. And so what they did was they moved out of, they decided to move out of the Shockley Transistor Company and go out on their own. But of course, then as now, going out on your own means that you need to have some financing. And so they kind of, these guys were well known at the time. Shockley's company was a huge name. So when it became, clear that there were a bunch of people who wanted to leave, they were able to get financing. And they got their major financing. There's another picture of the traitorous 8 in their company. They got their major financing from a camera company that had been around for quite some time. Camera company that was headed in Boston. And this, I don't know if you can read. This is the aerial age back in 1921. And what they're doing is telling you, wow, look at the kinds of photography that you can make from a plane if you know how to do it. And that's Columbia University there. That's the Columbia University football field and everything there. And it was done by the, you can read it right there on the bottom, the Fairchild Aerial Camera Corporation. Fairchild, which was at the time one of the leading camera companies in the country. And Fairchild agreed to finance the traitorous 8 as they were going to start their own company.